Hello and welcome in another episode of our special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file. 1 month after Russian President Vladimir Putin asserted that Ukraine should be liberated from the historical mistake of its independence, the Russian Defense Ministry has announced that Russia's war aims were limited to the Donbas region and were nearly completion. This climb down is undoubtedly laying the groundwork for selling the operation as a success to the Russian public despite an awful military combat performance. But that does not mean a rapid end to the war. The stalled operation raised many questions, few of which will be discussed with our panel of guests. We have Dr. Rafiq Abdessalam, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Tunisia and a current head of Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies from London. And we also have Dr. Abdenour Toumi, journalist and Maghreb Studies at Orsam, Turkey, joining us from Paris. Thank you for both guests for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into any discussion, let's start with the latest updates about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. US President Joe Biden says Russia's war in Ukraine has been a strategic failure for Moscow and that Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power. The Kremlin slams commands and says it is up to Russians to choose their president. Russian forces capture Ukraine's Slavotyech, where workers from the Chernobyl nuclear plant live, and 3 people have been killed, according to the mayor. Russian forces have fired at nuclear research reactor in the eastern city of Kharkiv, the Ukrainian parliament claims. And 5 people have been wounded in missile attacks on Lviv in western Ukraine, according to the region's governor. Let me start with you, Dr. Rafiq Abdessalam. According to Western nations, having failed in its initial attempts to seize several Ukrainian cities, and with its logistics in disarray, Russia has been forced to focus on one target at a time. Mariupol is the current main effort. Once that port city falls, Kharkiv is likely to be the next target, followed by an attempt to push north along the Dnieper River to cut off Ukrainian forces in the Donbas. If the Russians can hold Kherson, this would pave the way for a Russia-initiated ceasefire, with a lane created between the Donbas and Crimea, and Russian propaganda claiming to have averted a fictional Ukrainian genocide against ethnic Russians in the Donbas. What do you think, Doctor? Are these estimates right according to Western nations? Is the war still going to linger on?
I think it's quite clear that the Russians are facing great difficulties on the ground. And there is a gap between what was planned by the generals and the military staff and what is going on the ground. They assume that the military operation will achieve its goals within a few days, if not few hours. But it's quite clear now the war is becoming more and more complicated, with the intervention of Western countries, of the NATO members, mainly Europeans and the Americans, and the Russians are facing more and more difficulties on the ground. This is maybe will push the Russians to reshape their strategy from controlling the land and the ground of the whole Ukraine to the eastern border of Ukraine, Donbas region. This is due to the difficulties that they are facing on the ground. As I said before, it's quite clear there is a huge gap between what is planned and assumed by the military and the political actors in Moscow and what's happening on the ground.
Very nice indeed. Dr. Abdenour Toumi, even these more limited aims promise fierce fighting. Kharkiv, close to the Russian border, has already been subjected to heavy bombardment, whose intensity is likely to increase, and Ukraine has few options for preventing it. On the other hand, the fight northwards along the Dnieper will probably be met with stiff resistance, with continuing Western arms supplies leading to heavy attrition among Russian armor. The outcome of this fighting is far from inevitable. It would be a serious error to expect the war to end at this point. However, even if local ceasefires and expanded negotiations suggest diplomacy may prevail. What do you think?
First of all, good afternoon, and thank you for having me, and good afternoon to your distinguished guest, Dr. Absalam. Yes, I mean, as we all know now, we entered practically in second month of this war, which was aimed to be quick. I mean, speaking of difficulties, let me quote here, or have a quote from Karl von Clausewitz. I mean, once he says, everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is the difficult. So and here we are in this moment. And also it's very interesting, I mean, before to answer to your question, we have to make stop here on the yesterday's Joe Biden's speech in Warsaw. And interestingly enough, I mean, frankly, it sounded like Ronald Reagan's speech in from last century in 1988 from the Western Germany side of the Berlin Wall, and addressing directly to then Mikhail Gorbachev, asking him to tear down this wall. I mean, this is actually, I stated this before before the show, and I said this is, or the war in Ukraine now has become a Cold War, I mean, annexation of the Cold War, or what has left or didn't finish in the Cold War. Now it has become a hot war, and it sounds like it's going for an endless war. Also interesting, because in the speech of Joe Biden, he mentioned the visit of John Paul II to Poland in 1979, and we all know, I mean, the Pope was a Polish, and the ramifications of that speech that led to the creation of the Solidarność that challenged the Jaruzelski regime at that moment, and we all know 10 years later what happened to the parameter and the expansion of the Soviet Union in the region, and then in Afghanistan. So it is very interesting. We are in the dynamic of the balance of power between the East and the West, and this is now has become clear because if we saw the map that the countries that voted for the sanction against Russia and the one who were opposite to those sanctions, it becomes clear that there is in the horizon a new world order is put in place. Now, on the domestic front, I mean, I'm not an expert on military issues, but it's still, I mean, Putin and the Russians are still pushing to get the Kiev, because it is symbolic, and to see the Kiev collapse and then push the Ukrainian authorities for an eventual negotiation, which is, unfortunately, those talks are not going that well that they were maybe a week or 2 weeks ago.
Very nice. Speaking of Joe Biden's visit to Poland, which he ended with a speech that alleged President Vladimir Putin, in which Biden said Russian President Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power, and he called him a butcher. On the other hand, the Kremlin dismissed the remark by US President Joe Biden on Saturday that Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power, saying it was up to Russians to choose their own president.
We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. Don't even think about moving on 1 single inch of NATO territory. We have sacred obligation.
You know, you're dealing every day with Vladimir Putin. I mean, look at what he's done to these people. What does it make you think?
He's a butcher.
Dr. Rafiq Abdussalam, what's Biden trying to do here? His remarks implied that the shift of the war between the West and the Russian leader is going to be domesticated, i.e., we're trying to stoke up opposition against Putin at home. Do you think this could actually work?
Well, I think, as I said before, this is not just a Ukrainian-Russian war, bearing in mind that the NATO members and the Americans are in the vanguard in this conflict, this military as well politically conflict. The Russians are not, happy with their position in the international order. If we remember what Putin had said, I think in 2007 in Munich, when he said that the most dramatic event is the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the American strategy since that time, since the beginning of the 90s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans are in process to unsiege Russia, and the Russians are seeing what happened in their borders, in their southern as well western borders, as expansion of the NATO. They see it as a threat, a direct threat to their national security. And this is what complicated the situation with the intervention of the Russians in other areas, mainly in the Middle East, and including in their borders in Georgia as well, in other parts of the previous USSR. The Russians want to send a strong message that Russia is coming back to the international scene, and what was accepted in the beginning of the 90s with Yeltsin, it is no longer accepted by Putin. So this war is not about a dualistic conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It is a tense conflict between the Russians as well, the Russians and the Americans and the Europeans. The Russians were to impose themselves and to send a strong message that Russia is here, and it is no longer, accepted to be just a regional power. It is a superpower, and it wants, to impose itself within the European hemisphere and the neighboring countries.
Very nice indeed. Dr. Abdel Toumi, as our distinguished guest said, Russia is trying to impose itself and says that I am here, that I exist, and I am stronger. I'm no longer a Russia of the old times. So Dr. Abdel Toumi, apparently Biden understands that, and waging an all war with Russia directly could lead to catastrophic consequences. And apparently he's attempting to turn the domestic front against him. What's your take on this?
Sure. I mean, and it started from the fall of the Soviet Union and the, I would say, short years of Yeltsin. And President Putin, when he came to power in 1999, I mean, he never appreciated that moment of Yeltsin and how the West treated him and to some extent denigrated him and the entire Russian people and Russian culture. So President Putin from day one, I mean, he has that actually, I would say, prudence and also careful strategy toward the West. He never trusted them, even though when he met with George Bush in Texas, and then when George W. Bush at that moment, I mean, in 2000, I believe, when he said, 2001, when he said, I mean, I saw in Vladimir like a good fellow and so on. But Putin didn't want to play with that emotion relation. He set himself and his country as seriously as Dr. Abdussalam stated, a superpower. And from that moment, the West, and notably the Americans who are speaking or who are, leading the West, have that suspicion toward him, and especially in his maneuvers in the Middle East and notably in Syria and Libya. But that, I mean, they turned. I mean, they didn't want to bother him on that front. But when it came to this war, and actually it's a double, I would say, perception, because the Russians felt that the NATO is getting closer to them, and the West is thinking also. I mean, there is an expansion that is moving toward their interests and their national security issues. So the Russians are very, very careful on this, and of course they don't want to clash, so that the West doesn't want to clash with Russia because they know where the consequences will be very, very bad for the entire region. However, now the NATO policies and in the new, I would say, era of kind of arm race has been implemented during the last, in these 30 days of war. So the entire defense policies of those countries are now in this regard, are looking for another options and other strategies because of the direct threat that is posed by both superpowers.
Very nice. And speaking of Russia's expansion, according to Ukrainian authorities, 2 strategic infrastructures were hit and 5 people injured in a series of strikes on the city of Lviv, a large city in western Ukraine, relatively safe from the military operations so far. Zara Farjani has more details, and we get back to the discussion.
At least 5 people were reportedly injured Saturday after at least 3 missiles struck Lviv, a city in western Ukraine that had been previously spared from Russian attacks, according to local officials. Maxim Kozatsky, the head of the Lviv Regional Military Administration, confirmed this Saturday attacks.
2 strategic infrastructures were affected. One of them is a fuel depot in the city of Lviv, in a residential area. The second is a military site, a factory also located in a residential area. 2 strikes were made on each of them.
There was no immediate comment on the Lviv attacks from the Russian authorities, who refer to the situation in Ukraine as special military operation aimed at demilitarizing the country. Mayor of Lviv, Andriy Sadovy, said the attacks had caused significant damage to infrastructure facilities.
With today's strikes, the attackers want to say hello to President Biden, who is currently in Poland. Lviv is only 70 kilometers from the Polish border. I think the world needs to understand that the threat is very, very serious.
Lviv is a strategic Ukrainian city close to the Polish border that hasn't been bombarded, unlike much of the cities across the country during the Russian military operation. The series of strikes came just a day after the Russian military said that the first phase of the conflict had ended and that it was shifting its attention to the disputed eastern parts of Ukraine.
Dr. Rafiq Abdessalam, a general collapse in Russian forces is anticipated to offer the best chance for Ukraine to retake what was lost in 2014 and 2015. Having pulled Russia's hand into a mangle, Volodymyr Zelensky has no intention of letting Russia take it out. Even if he wanted to, the Ukrainian government could do little to stop insurgency by Ukrainians in the occupied territories. These dynamics pose some difficult questions. Those seeking off-ramps may in fact be pressuring Ukraine to surrender longer-term advantages to Moscow. For Ukraine, Russia's curtailed objectives offer the space for more maximalist ambitions. The question is whether the West shares them. What do you think, Doctor?
I think, as I said before, the Russians are facing great difficulties on the ground. And bearing in mind that the main strategy or the main priorities for the Russians is to demilitarize Ukraine as to neutralize the country. Due to the inclinations and the willingness of Kiev to be a member within the NATO, and with the heavy military presence of the NATO on the borders of the Russians. So they took this military initiative, but they assumed, as I said before, that they will achieve their goals within a few days. But with the American and the European interventions, with the military as well, political and financial support, it is quite clear that the Russians are facing great difficulties. They are obliged now to modify their goals. They are becoming more humble. They said that the main priority, this is a special operation, and on the top of the priorities and on the top of their goals is to control the eastern part of Ukraine and to preserve or to safeguard their presence in the Donbass region. And as I said before, this is not a war about Ukraine. It's more complicated. It's about the international order. If you remember with the visit of Yeltsin to Beijing just few days to China, just few days before the military operation, and the declaration that they released at that time, it expressed and reflected the intentions of the two superpowers to work in favor of more multipolar international orders. In the beginning of the 90s, the Americans assumed that it is no longer, a dualistic international order with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they are the only superpower that could control the international scene. But it's quite clear now the international order is more complicated with the presence of the Russians, with the presence of the Chinese. But I'm not sure about, the position of the Russians after this military operation in Ukraine. It's quite clear that it will affect the military psychology, the psychology of their military machine, and the relation with the Americans as well with the Europeans will be more and more complicated.
To me, some experts also raise the question now is whether or not the West would be bold enough to overcome its fears of a Russian escalation using chemical or nuclear weapons, which, according to the same experts, would offer no tactical advantage to Moscow and step up support to Ukraine even further. What's your take in this?
I think on the existential issue of the use of chemical weapons, or even, we heard about nuclear weapons. I think would be suicidal move from each side, but I don't think we are in that apocalyptic scenario. Hopefully not. I was going to say yet, but hopefully will never happen for the sake of the humanity. Mm-hmm. But as far as the mission or the aim of this war, this operation that was launched by the Russians to capture Kiev and demilitarize the entire country and eventually push for the collapse of the government and will replace it with a friendly government toward Moscow is not working. So this is why the entire military strategy is changing now, and also we are looking after the resistance or of the determination of the Ukrainian resistance today. We are hearing, and we saw some reports that would make the military operation for Russia more difficult, because we saw some they are moving toward a trench war, and this is very, very difficult in the coming days for the Russians army, and as Dr. Absalam stated, for the psychological aspect or action of the military, even on the front, is not doing that well, and it's very, very dangerous for them, psychologically to put in place this mission and eventually lead to a victory like President Putin wants to see. But we are also in another dynamic in this conflict or in this war when we saw the focus of the Russians these days on the east side and just making some moves toward in center and in the west. It looks like the more the war goes, the more Russians want it, because in the end of the day, they want to have something serious to take the Ukrainian authorities to the negotiation table as weak partners.
Yes, and let me share with you this info. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky pleads Western countries to receive more weapons to defend his country and his freedom, as well as that of Europe. He also accuses Russia of wanting to destroy everything that makes Ukrainian people an independent population.
What is the price of the security? It is very precise. These are planes for Ukraine. These are tanks for our state. This is missile defense. It is a weapon against ships. That's what our partners have, which have only dust. After all, this is all for the freedom, not just of Ukraine, but the freedom of Europe.
I get back to you, Dr. Rafiq Abdussalam. More equipment such as long-range rockets, artillery and drones, coupled with provision of Western intelligence, could enable Kiev to move from defense to attack. What do you think are we going to see next?
I think we are in process to see more mess. The balance of power is not in favor of one party against the other. Although the Russians have the overwhelming, military capability compared to their counterpart, to the Ukrainians, but with the support of the NATO members, mainly the Americans, the logistic, support, the military support as well, the financial one, we may see some balance of power on the ground, and this is reflected on the difficulties that are facing the Russians. As I said before, they assumed that this would be a quick military operation within, few days, that they will control everything. They will control the land, the air, and the sea. But it's not the counterpart of the Russians is not only the Ukrainians. They are facing now a military presence of although the NATO members are not directly intervening by personnel, by military, direct presence, but they are with their support. The conflict is transforming a wider conflict between the Russians and the Americans and the NATO members. And I think we are moving towards a more mess in Ukraine. And this will be reflected also in the international order as a whole. It's no longer the case when the Americans and the Russians in the Cold War, when every part, fixed its field or its sphere of presence, of influence, we may see more, anarchism, more conflict, different, kinds of conflicts in the international order, including the MENA region, the Middle East and North African countries. This reflects the complexity of the situation. The American assumed in the beginning of the 90s that we are moving towards a unipolar international order where there is no competition, except the Americans are the superpower. The other countries are not either close allied to the Americans or minor players. Now it is clear that the Americans are facing a lot of conflicts and as well polarization within the international order between the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, with the emergence of new powers, regional as international powers. So definitely the situation will be more and more complicated.
Yes, indeed. Dr. Abdenour Toumi, apparently Russia has more work ahead to achieve even the more modest goal of driving Ukraine's forces out of the east of the two regions that make up the Donbass. Its defense ministry says Russian-backed forces control 93% of the Luhansk, but only 54% of the Donetsk. Meanwhile, Ukraine is sounding increasingly confident. How do you see this, Professor Abdenour?
Certainly. Russia now is facing more difficulties than they expected it. And this is, I think it started from this so-called, or they call it special operation objectives. And that, they failed by all means. And now, two days ago, when the vice defense minister came to the media and spoke about his new operation, that he will be focusing on the Donbass area and the opposite sea. And this is interesting in the dynamic of the ongoing war. But on the other hand, the Ukrainians are in very, very difficulties. And we all, as we saw now, Kiev is in dire, and all the cities are in terrible situation, adding to a tragic humanitarian crisis that is going on and that will be laid ahead. But the question here is, when the Dr. Abdesalam stated about the global imperatives of the international order that was set during the Cold War and then in the post-Cold War, going from bipolar system to unipolar system. Now, the prospects are, the new countries or raising states and new regional powers emerge, such as India, Brazil, and in the MENA region, Turkey. And so all these, need to be, I mean, the prospect of the Russia on one hand and the US as the leader of the West, I mean, they should look at those new emerged or rising states in the equation of the new international system.
And according to Ukrainian officials, Russian soldiers took control of a village where the defunct Chernobyl nuclear plant workers reside, and temporarily, and 3 people have been killed, which provoked demonstrations. I get back to you, Dr. Abdesalam. Why nuclear plants each time are being targeted? We know that Russia technically wants to demilitarize Ukraine and wants to be safe in its borders. But each time such nuclear plants are targeted, the problem of radiation is always raised, and apparently Russia doesn't care about that.
I think the risk is there, but if nuclear power is used in this military conflict, that will be very risky for the Russians, not only for the Americans or mainly the Europeans, who are due to the geography they will pay, they will see the repercussions on their territories. But I think nuclear power remains at the end of the day a deterrent power. If it is used on the ground, that will be change the whole military as well political scene. So definitely the Russians are very strong they have the second arsenal in nuclear powers, but this does not mean that they have the ability to use it, because if they use it, they will face and the counterpart the use from the NATO members, mainly for the Americans. So they need to calculate this tactic because it has a huge repercussions on their security as well, or the balance of power with the relationship with the Americans and the Europeans. I don't think so that they use the nuclear military or the military capability, because for the simple reason it is a deterrent power, and if it uses it will be catastrophic, for the Europeans, the Americans, but as well for the Russians themselves.
Yes, Dr. Abdenour, as Dr. Abdesalam said, he is dismissing the fact that they might actually go to nuclear weapons, but Russia earlier did mention the fact that if they are threatened, they would actually have resort to nuclear weapons.
No, I totally agree with Dr. Abdesalam. And as I stated, I mean, will be terrible consequences, not only for the regions, I mean, Europe and...
but that's the Russian Defense Ministry that stated that. They stated, and it was an exclusive interview with CNN, in which the Russian Defense Minister actually stated that they would have resort to nuclear power or nuclear weapons if the existence of Russia is threatened. And we see the escalation is going higher and higher, especially that we have Joe Biden at the borders and calling Putin a butcher and so on and so forth. So where do you think this would lead?
But indeed, I mean, it's still rhetoric. I mean, it's still rhetorical speech. But again, I don't think it will happen because, I mean, the consequences are very, very, very different. And again, it's an apocalyptic scenario. So, but what is interesting here when we speak about nuclear, I mean, we are missing a key word here. It's dissuasion. I mean, the prospect of the nuclear, I mean, it's meant to be to dissuade. I mean, in the Cold War era and post-Cold War era, I mean, to dissuade the adversary or the potential adversary with a nuclear weapon. So again, I don't think this will happen because, I mean, the consequences will be terrible. And
aren't they terrible enough already? I mean, let me just share with you the United Nations Development Program, which is saying that the economic impact of the war will take a great toll on Ukraine only, or on many generations to come. It estimates that 18 years old of socio-economic achievements could be lost, with almost 90% of the population living below below the poverty line, and a further 62% at high risk of falling into poverty within the next 12 months, while Russian forces have so far destroyed at least $100 billion worth of infrastructure, leading 50% of Ukrainian businesses to shut down completely. And here I might raise the question of what would be the repercussions even on the world. Dr. Abdenour.
On the economic aspect?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it is already terrible. And again, Ukraine is in a very, very bad situation. And it looks like the entire infrastructure has been demolished. And the economic aspects would be, or impact would be very difficult. But however, the West is already, pouring money into it, and it's showing their support for the Ukraine. And, again, it goes back to history. Europeans and the West in general has that sympathy or empathy when it comes to rebuild a nation. And we saw that with Marshall Plan in the post-World War II, and then how it did go well. And then that started the democratization process in Europe, and that brought stability and prosperity to Europe. And this is one of the aim of the West and the message sent in to President Putin himself to, again, not push too far and not destabilize further the region, because, again, the consequences economically would be very, very difficult for him as well.
And it would be inevitable in any ways. Dr. Abdeslam, just recently the Houthi rebels targeted a power or energy plant in Saudi Arabia, and many experts raised the questions that it's not something naive that just happened or something that just appeared out of the blue. It's something that was plotted for so as to perhaps prevent Saudi Arabia from helping, the Western nations from, surrogating for the energy that was lost from Russia. What do you think, Dr. Abdeslam?
I think this will add another difficulties to the already, difficult economic, situation all over the world after the pandemic, crisis, or the effect of the coronavirus pandemic on the international economy. It is another element, catastrophic element, which is added right now with the military, conflict in Ukraine, and with the targeting of the energy supplies in Saudi Arabia or energy bases there. This will affect the supply of energy to the international economy, and definitely will raise the prices of oil and gas, which is already too high for the consumer. I think this will add another difficulties and complexity in the financial and economic repercussions of this war. Bearing in mind that roughly during the last 2 years, already the economic international system is facing great difficulties. It is roughly very similar to the crisis of 1929 that faced the international economy with all its repercussions and effects on the European and the American economies at that time. Now, if we adding, this element, the element of war in Ukraine, the targeting of the energy supplies in Saudi Arabia, as well with the affections of the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic on the financial and economy. This means that I think we are going to face great difficulties and heavy repercussions all over the world, including in Europe and the United States.
And especially the Arab world. Dr. Abdenour Toumi, perhaps you might give us any final words regarding this particular point, since we noticed recently that President Volodymyr Zelensky was addressing Gulf countries through the Doha Energy Forum, in which he emphasized on the fact that these Gulf countries could have a substantial and a very important role in, pumping energy products to Europe in substitution to Russia. So knowing that these Gulf countries perhaps are not really able to defend themselves, and we see this pressure from United States on these Gulf countries to produce more energy products, is something that is going to be met with the severe consequences. And just as I mentioned earlier, the recent Houthi rebels strike to power plants. Dr. Abdenoor Toumi.
Indeed, I mean, this war, I mean, it has, I mean, direct repercussions on the economic aspect on the European countries, I mean, who are dealing directly with or who are depending directly to the Russia gas and energies. But as far as the Houthi issue, I mean, we should, I mean, raise the question, I mean, why he's anticipating all these actions these days, and it doesn't, I mean, make too much sense, because, I mean, the conflict that has been in for more than 7 years now, and it is on the sub-regional level. So, of course, I mean, it has this international aspect, and the U.S. should look at this, because the Saudi Arabia is still the good suppliers of oil on the global market, and also now.
Dr. Abdenoor Toumi, point clear. Thank you so much. We ran out of time. Thank you, my dear distinguished guest, for joining us live here from Algiers. Thank you, dear viewers, for tuning in to our channel. It's time to wrap up the special coverage. Bye for now.